Hey guys, in this video the lovely team is going to be taking you through research methods and sources for your GCSE Citizenship. There are lots of things in here that you need to be aware of, that you need to know so you don't trip up and make mistakes. To help you with this, over on my website there are thousands of multiple choice questions.
There are two basic types of research methods. Textual analysis, which involves using textual sources like books, journals, or newspaper articles, and statistical analysis, which involves using data or statistics. Statistical analysis is effectively numbers-based. Primary sources are sources direct from individuals, such as politicians, whereas secondary sources are sources written by others after or about the events. For example, newspaper columns written about an election. An example of a primary textual source would be a text of a speech as it was delivered by a politician, for example at party conference or while campaigning. A primary statistical source would be something like actual voting data from an election. This is publicly available. An example of a secondary textual source would be an analysis made by a journalist or a pundit of a politician's speech. And a secondary statistical source may be an academic series of graphs illustrating voting patterns. There are several advantages and disadvantages of statistical research. The advantages include the following. Data is concrete and objective. It's often publicly available and easy to find. Usually it's provided by a reliable source, such as the Electoral Commission or another trusted government department. You can draw strong and concrete conclusions from data, which often gives you the ability to give a positive or negative answer to a hypothesis or question. The disadvantages include the following. Not every topic has available data. Some obscure or fringe topics may have data which is difficult to find. You may even have to submit something like a Freedom of Information request to access it. Information for past elections and events is not always available. Certainly information for events and elections before maybe 1964 can be tricky to find. Data analysis can be limited. There is a limited amount of conclusions that you can draw from data, and often, as is always the case with statistics, your conclusions are open to interpretation and the data itself is open to interpretation and bias. There are also several advantages and disadvantages of carrying out textual research. Advantages include the following. You can perform an in-depth analysis of language and statements. You're not limited to merely data. You can use this to make a subjective rather than objective analysis of the character and aims of the individual. You can use this to lead to a strong, although obviously biased, conclusion. Speeches and statements made by senior politicians are usually publicly viewable. Those made by the Prime Minister or Cabinet Ministers tend to be available through government websites. There are also disadvantages. Textual analysis is by its nature subjective. It's open to debate and it's vulnerable to your own personal bias. Social media and internet transcripts of speeches are not always reliable. It's very easy, for example, to take a very small snippet, part of a sentence, for example, of a speech, and take it out of context to give the wrong impression. Textual analysis is also, by its nature, time-consuming and difficult. Without the exact politician there in front of you to interpret their words, the best you can do is come up with your own conclusions on what has been said. Here we can see an example of a source on which we can do statistical research. This source was provided by the UK Parliament and is publicly available. It uses the election results in 2017 for the Skipton and Ripon constituency in North Yorkshire. To briefly explain what you can see, the number of votes cast for each candidate, the percentage of the vote that each candidate received, and the change. All of the numbers here are green, indicating that they all received a higher percentage than last time. If they were red, it would indicate their vote share had gone down. We can draw several conclusions from this. The first is the most obvious, that Julian Smith of the Conservative Party received the largest number of votes by a long way and was therefore elected as Member of Parliament for Skipton and Ripon. The second is also relatively obvious. We can see from the green colour that all four of these parties increased their share of the vote. Now that would only be possible if previous parties, perhaps a fifth and sixth party that had stood before this election, had dropped out and not stood. Given that we don't seem to have a Liberal Democrat, that seems likely. The last conclusion is the most difficult. The Liberal Democrats didn't stand in this election, so we can look to see where their vote went. Labour increased their vote by the largest amount, so it's entirely plausible to work on the assumption that much of the Liberal Democrat vote transferred to them. However, some may have gone to the Conservatives, as they also increased their vote. There may also have been other parties standing. For example, UKIP seems likely. It's possible that a large amount of their vote transferred to the Conservatives. A fifth conclusion we could draw is that the Yorkshire Party, which we can assume are effectively independent, or a local party, and the Greens increased their vote a very small amount, indicating they probably haven't lost or gained large amounts of votes. All of these conclusions can be drawn from this small amount of data. Some of them, the first few, are undeniable. However, the ones we made about other parties and their vote swing are less reliable, and they are open to bias. This is an example of a textual source. Specifically, this is a speech by Kenneth Clarke, the former Chancellor and Home Secretary, given at the Conservative Party conference in 2006. He said, "Initially, Mr. Brown was in denial. Now even he has finally admitted that his forecasts for economic growth were wildly optimistic, as every expert said. His golden rule turned out to be fool's gold. He even had to change the starting date of the economic cycle to include the 2 years of surplus that he only achieved by sticking to my spending figures when Labour came to power. I suppose you might call it a compliment. The tragedy is that Gordon Brown could have done great things with our inheritance, but he's blown it. He has turned out to be just another tax and spend Labour Chancellor, but on a lucky streak." We can draw several conclusions from this speech. The first is that this is a partisan speech, which you would expect at a party conference. It's an attack on Labour. Secondly, we have the use of puns in fool's gold. Mr. Clarke has a reputation for being a humorous and gregarious figure, and that bears up in the language he used. He uses the third person as he. Rather than using they and attacking Labour as a whole, he specifically attacks Mr. Brown, and he uses mine and I to relate himself to the audience personally, many of whom will know him, and paint himself in a good light, especially in comparison to the aforementioned Mr. Brown. Now, all of these conclusions can be drawn from this piece of text, and this is only a small piece of a publicly available text. However, all of these conclusions are open to debate. Unlike statistical research, textual research often builds in bias, and you never get the full picture. By carrying out textual research on multiple sources about a subject, however, you may be able to build up a full picture.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.